Currently, I'm reading World Classics, the world's classics, Thomas Hardy, Jude the Obscure. Look at this. This is the book. So, previously it was named as A Simpleton's Heart's Insurgent. And that was a time when this came out as a serialized story over in many of these newspapers. Thomas Hardy essays the contemporary prudery of his times. His is a deep desire to break up the conventions in respect of manners, custom, religion, if you just go through this. And in this book particularly, there are 6 sections, 6 parts. Like for example, the first part is Mary Green, and in that you have a few chapters. Then the second part is at Christminster. The second part is 1 to 8 parts it has. Then part 3 is at Melchester. These are different places. Part 4 is at Shaston. So it has 6 chapters in there. And part 5th is at Aldbrickham and elsewhere. And then part 6 again is back to at Christminster. So what we find that each section is named after a setting in a particular place. I particularly found the protagonist desires to study heart-wrenching. An 11-year-old boy sees off his teacher, gives him a tearful farewell, who's going for university education at Christminster, and that stayed in his head. And in these 6 parts, he is mentioned Christminster twice. It's like today's Oxford, rather the fictional Oxford. The protagonist, that is Jude, wants to study at Christminster, and he faces so much of class struggle. You'll find the whole book is it's multi-layered strands of class struggle and unconventional relationship, and it is also a societal critique if you go through it. And as you go through these contents, you'll also go through it. It progresses the story of Jude Foley and his relationships. And there are tragic outcomes because or due to societal pressures. He works as a stone mason, but dreams of studying at Christminster. And throughout you feel that Jude's desire for education for a better life. That was the basic thing. Then, so initially there's this Arabella, the girl or the lady who influences the plot throughout, highlighting, say, his flaws in his younger days. And Arabella is throughout the story because the son, whom she names as Little Jude, plays a part in the tragic end, as you'll see. You'll find harsh realities and limitations. And as one sees that an individual is a victim of one's circumstances. And while you go through it, there's an outcome of fatalism also, as if you're gazing into an abyss. Then you also have the tension. Sue is his love interest, and still, tensions rise and that leads to tragedy, etc. But the language, if you see, is quite poetical. He writes well, Thomas Hardy, as you know. So the story goes on that before he wrote the Jude the Obscure, this novel, the name being taken from Berkshire surname, Hardy had once met a lad driving a baker's cart who asked if he might borrow a Latin grammar from him. And this incident is vividly made use of in the book. And then as early as 1887, he had been making notes for Jude, and in April 1888, he had written in his notebook a short story of a young man who could not go to Oxford, his struggles and ultimate failure, etc. That's how he wrote. And the seed of Jude the Obscure lay germinating for 7 years, it seems, before its appearance in serial form, that is December 1894 to November 1895. And it is said that Hardy had published a letter called On the Tree of Knowledge in the New Review, in company with other contributors who had been asked whether a young girl should be informed of sexual matters before marriage. He alone amongst the contributors made the suggestion that boys as well as girls should be initiated. So, then it's written, for it has never struck me that the spider is invariably male and the fly invariably female. Jude's sexual ignorance is one of the causes of his lamentable marriage and his ultimate downfall. If you read the story, you'll come to know. Hardy's aim in writing Jude was clearly given in his preface to the novel. If you go through so here is a preface to the first edition here. If you just go through it, you come to know a little background of about the novel. So he says it has begun as a serial story in Harper's Magazine at the end of November 1894, and it was continued in monthly parts. But as in the case of Tess of the Ubervilles, the magazine version was for various reasons an abridged and modified one, the present edition being the first in which the whole appears as originally written. So all of that you can go through. So he says Jude the Obscure is simply an endeavor to give shape to the coherence to a series of seemings or personal impressions. The question of their consistency or their discordance, of their permanence or other transitionariness being regarded as not of the first moment. Then you have the postscript in the preface itself. The issue of this book 16 years ago, with the explanatory preface given above, was followed by unexpected incidents, and one can now look back for a moment at what happened. So all of that, just go through it. When you're reading it, it's important that you also read the preface. So when you go through the preface, Hardy's aim in writing Jude are clearly given in this preface to the novel and in letters written to a close friend in 1895 after its publication. In the former, he tells us that he had attempted to deal unaffectedly with the fret and fever, derision and disaster that may press in the wake of the strongest passion known to humanity, to tell without a mincing of words of a deadly war waged between flesh and spirit, and to point the tragedy of unfulfilled aims. In the letters, he says, the grimy features of the story go to show the contrast between the ideal life a man wished to lead and the squalid real life he was fated to lead. The throwing of the pistol at the supreme moment of his young dream is to sharply initiate the contrast. The idea was meant to run all through the novel, It is in fact to be discovered in everybody's life, though it lies less on the surface perhaps than it does in my poor puppets, he says. Of course, the book is all contrast, or was meant to be in its original conception. Sue and her heathen gods get against Jude's reading the Greek Testament. Christ minister, academical Christ minister in the slums, Jude the saint, Jude the sinner, Sue the pagan, Sue the saint, marriage, no marriage, etc., etc. In a third, he stresses the point that the book makes for morality and that delicacy or indelicacy in a writer's according to his object. If I say to a lady that I met a naked woman, it is indelicate. But if I go on to say I found she was mad with sorrow, it ceases to be indelicate. And in writing Jude, my mind was fixed on the ending. In 1890, Hardy also wrote a poem called Thoughts of Vina, etc. He made Jude as a kind of study. Hardy's closest approach to the psychologically subtle after Michael Henchard in The Mayor of Casterbridge, I think. Few are now concerned with the meaningless and emasculated form of the novel as it appeared in serial installments. But some memory, some scent, as from a sacrificial holocaust of the excretions heaped on it when it appeared in volume form, still cling to this much absurd book, which an irate bishop in England and a man in Australia burnt. The former denounced it in a letter to the Yorkshire Post, calling it garbage, and the latter informed Hardy that the packet of ashes enclosed were those of the pages of Jude. The antagonistic reviewers called it titanically bad, an exposition of the unclean. On the other hand, admirers gave it extravagant praise. It was the most splendid of all the works which he had given to the world, one of the most touching records in all our literature. Profound and unfathomable depths of gloom and greatness. And also some people gave him assurance that the tragedy was equally beautiful and terrible in its pathos. Now, if Tess had aroused a curiosity as to Hardy's religious faith, Jude brought a more distressing series of letters and articles questioning and making assumptions on the author's private life. The book was said to be a treatise on the marriage question as well as autobiographical. Christminster was pointed at as being Oxford. Well, he was stung into defiance, bewildered by the virulence and number of the attacks, and determined to escape the legend of himself. Once again, he seems to have been unaware of the vehemence of the bitter and aggressive sides of his nature. He thought himself as a mild, inoffensive countryman, a harmless agnostic, rather than a clamorous atheist, a teller of tales, a recorder of seemings or impressions, a chronicler of moods and deeds, rather than a philosopher or reformer. He liked to be called the man with the watching eye. Humility made him say to a reporter that he was only a learner in the art of novel writing, and that as regards Tess, it was too much to hope that he had been able to bring about any changes in the treatment or attitude to those intricate problems which hedge about the sexes. What is it which angered and disgusted the readers of Jude? So what was it? Granted that